Thank you for joining me for another Quick Hits conversation. I'm Dr. Robyn, also known as Mental MacGyver. I provide luxury level high performance support and coaching to executives, founders, celebrities, and athletes. With me today, I have Todd Karges. He has a background in project management and building agile development mindsets. He is a transformation and change management practitioner and leadership coach based outside of Toronto. I have Atif Agha. He is a technology specialist doing data analytics and an avid runner. He's based in Chicago. And I have Agafitei. She's a strategy and design consultant for the health and wellness industry. She's based in Dublin. The question I have today, what do you do when someone is sharing too much personal information with you? Laura, kick us off.
Sure, that's an interesting question. And I think everybody has dealt with this at some point in their life. For me, it's something, it depends on the context, obviously. So if it's in a business environment, if that thing happens, I always ask the question, how is this related to the topic we are discussing? In that way, I feel that the person gets the space to be aware of what's happening, because sometimes in our head it makes sense, but when we say it out loud, we don't realize that maybe we just overshared some information that wasn't actually related to what we are discussing. So by posing that question, I feel everybody is always almost reacting to it, and then they apologize or they just take back and we go in another route or whatever the conversation goes. But it's personal. I always try to give the space to that person. I'm not quick to judge. I understand there can be triggers that we sometimes can manage the triggers, sometimes we cannot. We don't know everything that is going to trigger us. So respectfully, I'm just trying to hold space and just moving the conversation ahead.
I think it's an interesting question, to be honest, because I think it's different depending on which age group you're in. When we were young, relatively younger, I would say, we shared all kinds of personal information and never really cared about it. But now, even in personal circles or professional, there is a line where you do not share more than what you should share. And when I hear someone telling me some personal stuff, I literally run for yourself, because this is crazy. You don't want to know personal issues or other things after a certain point. There's a line that is very important to draw, what information you're getting about someone, because then it can make things uncomfortable going forward.
What's so interesting to me about what you're saying, Atif, is at least here in my world, the companies that I've worked in most recently, there's a real push for people to bring their whole selves to work. And right within that context, there's a lot of personal stuff that might pop up even within that, because one, like, we're just not trained to bring our whole selves to anywhere. We're maybe trained to bring our best selves. And again, perhaps the younger people are better at it than I am. And that's entirely possible too. What I think is really interesting is that when those things pop up, whether it's in a personal or a professional setting, I like to acknowledge that they've popped up, because there's two things that are going on. And Laura, to your point, like, maybe the person isn't aware that they're oversharing, but maybe they're also not aware of what that impact is on me to receive that information. So for me, it's really a two-step thing. The first question that I like to ask is, are you sure you want to continue sharing that information with me? Because maybe you do, maybe you don't. And if the answer is no, I absolutely do want to continue sharing that, and it's really uncomfortable for me, then that's when I say, actually, this is quite uncomfortable for me in this situation. So perhaps we shouldn't continue this line, right?
Yeah, I think, Laura, to your original point, context is extremely important. So as coaches or as managers or leaders, we are empathetic. We want to understand and care for our people, our teams, or our friends. But at the same time, I think there's a fine line to draw where it starts to become a problematic, and where you're really trying to help someone and understand their problem and go forward for it. So I think as you get more mature and get more understanding, you know where that line is. If someone's crossing that line, or they're really having a problem, and you want to hear that problem and help them out as maybe their boss or their manager or somebody like that. So And even with friends, you don't want to hear their financial problem. You don't want to hear everything personal, but you still want to be empathetic. You want to be their friends and want to care for them.
Mhm.
That's important.
I think about what Brene Brown says about the vulnerability hangover. Is this person going to be embarrassed later that I know this? Is this going to make it awkward? Because obviously, I mean, I'm trained to do this. Like people tell me stuff all the time. And if they're a client, absolutely no such thing as TMI. Tell me anything you want. But if you're not a client, if we know each other socially, is it going to be awkward for you to know that I know this in the future? The other thing that I wonder about is that when someone shares too much personal information with you or with anyone, do they then have to be concerned of where it's going to go next? Because now it's public fodder, and that's a challenge too.
And it depends on how private person you are and what kind of information you are sharing. Some people are very private, and then if they cross that line and sharing too much information, then they will continue to worry about where it's going to go.
Mhm.
So I think vulnerability hangover is critical. A lot of people don't ask themselves before they jump into it. It's just a spur of a moment where people jump into something and start sharing, this happened. I'm all right.
I definitely had one situation I can think of in my life where I was in an airplane coming back from Europe, and it had been a horrible trip with my ex-husband. And I completely unloaded on the person that was in the seat next to me. And I remember getting off the airplane thinking that poor person now has way more information than they ever, and they were very gracious about it. But I do remember being embarrassed when I left that airplane.
True.
But that was low risk too, wasn't it? Maybe it wasn't the most polite thing to do in the world, but at the same time, when we're in that space, in that psychological space that allows us to do that, I mean, it was probably safer than doing the same thing to a friend or a colleague.
I think sometimes it's easier to unload stuff on a stranger because you never have to see them again.
Yep.
There's no risk that they're going to tell somebody or know somebody. So I think that's something to consider when someone is telling you too much information. Are you part of their circle, or are they someone that they're going to bump into?
Mhm.
Or are you a stranger on an airplane where
Mhm.
it's just like, oh, they need someone to talk to?
Then there are people who just tell you everything and too much information all the time. It's like, oh my God, they're just going to unload and then they go on with their life. And I just have to kind of wonder where to park this for the
That's
next
a good
conversation.
point. Maybe we should talk about that. How do you tell someone, hey, we need to take a pause?
I think it comes with experience and practice.
Mm.
Where you're like, okay, I got to get back to my work. So this is important, I understand, but let's maybe table it for some time. And you'd be surprised. There is no next time.
Mm.
To me, it's like the difference between intent and impact. Someone may not intend to impact me negatively by telling me a personal story, but it may still impact me in person. And that's where I think, being transparent about that with the person you're talking to is important. It's still kind of my go-to.
Mm-hmm. Laura, how do you kind of tell someone to take a pause, like too much?
I agree with Todd as well. I mean, it depends on my mental state and how I'm in that moment. If I don't feel comfortable to give that space, I'm just going to say that respectfully, that it's not a good time for me to listen.
Mhm.
I always like to be generally present. So I'm a good listener, probably because I'm also an introvert. So for me, it's easier to listen than to talk. So people naturally come to me and say stuff, and I don't mind. But if I don't feel good energetically, I'm just going to say it, very clear, just to reschedule. It's maybe because they feel comfortable, or it's just I'm a really good listener, but it's just depending on my mood. I can be really straightforward. Before I wasn't, like, I would leave everybody and just unload everything on me, but now I learned my lesson, and I'm very, very paying attention on how I feel, because otherwise it's just it's draining and it's not good.
It's important to understand the intent, right? So you have to get that up front. Is what is the intent here? Is this really someone suffering and you want to help? You want to let's give them a shoulder? Absolutely, you do it. But if someone just in a habitual of just spitting everything out and just move on, you learn that over time, right? And also, it's important again, the context is important. Sometimes you're friend with both parties and you're like, man, I don't want to hear both sides of the story. I would be in trouble not to do what to do.
Yeah,
So-
the triangulation is something definitely that you have to avoid. And that is a really good place to end a 10-minute conversation about what to do when people are providing too much personal information. So thank you so much for having this with me. And I look forward to speaking to each of you again very soon.